40 kilometers from one of the most famous, most heavily developed luxury resort destinations on Earth sits an island that looks almost identical. The same volcanic peak, the same impossibly turquoise lagoon, the same white sand motu scattered around a coral reef. And yet, on this island, there isn't a single overwater bungalow, not one international resort chain, not one five-star hotel. For decades, developers have come knocking, offering the kind of money that could transform this tiny community overnight. And for decades, the roughly 1,200 people who live here have said no. This is Maupiti. And understanding why an entire community would repeatedly turn down that kind of money tells you almost everything you need to know about what they actually value. Picture an island that geologists will tell you is essentially a twin of Bora Bora, formed from the very same volcanic mountain range, roughly the same age, ringed by a lagoon just as impossibly blue, but almost nobody outside French Polynesia has ever heard of it. Picture a community small enough that everyone genuinely knows everyone else who voted, deliberately and collectively, to ban large hotel construction on their own island, even as visitors and developers alike kept insisting they were sitting on a genuine fortune. And picture a place so protective of its own isolation that its only entrance from the open ocean is considered one of the most dangerous boat passages in the entire South Pacific. A natural barrier the island has never seemed particularly interested in making any easier to cross. Why would a community this small choose isolation and simplicity over an obvious, life-changing payday? Let's find out. To understand Maupiti, it helps to start with its more famous neighbor, because the comparison explains almost everything about what makes this island so unusual. Maupiti sits in the Leeward Islands, part of French Polynesia's wider Society Islands group, only about 40 kilometers from Bora Bora, close enough that a small plane can cover the distance in a matter of minutes. Geologically, the two islands are essentially siblings, both formed from the same undersea volcanic hotspot, both eventually developing the same dramatic combination of a steep, jagged central peak surrounded by a wide, shallow lagoon and a protective outer reef. In fact, Maupiti is technically the older and more eroded of the two, sitting at the westernmost edge of the entire Society Islands chain, meaning it has spent even more time being slowly worn down by wind, rain, and ocean, a process that will, many millions of years from now, eventually reduce it, and eventually Bora Bora, too, to nothing more than a low coral atoll ringing an empty lagoon where a mountain used to stand. Maupiti's own summit, Mount Tirafatu, climbs to nearly 400 meters, offering hikers who make the steep climb to the top a sweeping view down onto a lagoon so clear and so vividly turquoise that photographs of it are frequently mistaken for images of Bora Bora itself. The entire island covers barely more than 11 square kilometers of land, a scale so small that a determined visitor could walk most of its coastal road in a single unhurried afternoon. In almost every way that matters visually, Maupiti offers the exact same postcard scenery that has made its neighbor one of the most recognizable luxury travel destinations on the entire planet. And yet the two islands could hardly have taken more different paths. Bora Bora, over the past half-century, transformed itself into a global symbol of luxury travel, its lagoon now lined with international resort chains, overwater bungalows stretching out from the shoreline on stilts, honeymooners and celebrities flying in from around the world to pay some of the highest nightly hotel rates found anywhere on Earth. That transformation brought genuine economic benefits to Bora Bora, well-paying jobs, modern infrastructure, and a level of international name recognition few small Pacific islands ever achieve. But it also reshaped the island fundamentally, concentrating land and tourism revenue heavily around large foreign-owned hotel operators, changing the rhythm and character of daily life for many of its residents in ways that aren't easily reversed. Land that once belonged to local families for generations has, in places, passed into long-term lease arrangements with international hotel groups. And much of the profit generated by that famous lagoon now flows back out to shareholders and corporate headquarters far beyond French Polynesia's own shores, rather than circulating entirely within the local economy. Maupiti watched all of this unfold from just across the water, and when developers eventually turned their attention toward the smaller island next door, seeing an obvious opportunity to replicate that same luxury resort model on a lagoon just as beautiful, the island's residents made a very different choice. At various points over the decades, Maupiti's community has been approached with serious proposals for large-scale hotel development, the kind of investment that, on paper, could have brought jobs, infrastructure, and a substantial boost to the local economy almost overnight, developers pointing directly at Bora Bora as proof of exactly how transformative that kind of money could be. Rather than accepting, the population repeatedly pushed back. And at a formal level, residents ultimately voted to prohibit the construction of large hotels on the island entirely, restricting tourist accommodation instead to small, family-run guest houses known locally as pensions de famille, modest operations typically built directly within a host family's own residential property rather than as standalone commercial hotels. Today, the entire island's tourist lodging capacity adds up to only around a dozen or so of these family pensions, scattered between the main village and a handful of the surrounding Motu islets. Roughly enough space to comfortably host around 100 visitors at any given time, a deliberate ceiling on growth that stands in stark contrast to the thousands of hotel rooms available just a short flight away. That decision wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't purely sentimental either. Islanders who supported the ban on large-scale hotels understood exactly what kind of money was potentially on the table, understood what a resort-driven economy had done, for better and worse, to communities on nearby islands, and chose deliberately to prioritize a different kind of future. Rather than importing large hotel chains, foreign management companies, and construction crews from outside the island entirely, most of whom would return the majority of that generated wealth to shareholders and corporate offices thousands of kilometers away, Maupiti chose a model where tourism revenue stays almost entirely within local hands, flowing directly to the families who own and operate each small pension, who cook the meals guests eat, who run the boat transfers out to the Motu, and who ultimately decide how much of their own island they're willing to open up to outside visitors in the first place. The island's geography has, in its own way, reinforced that choice, almost as if the landscape itself agrees with the community's decision. The only way into Maupiti's lagoon by boat is through a single narrow channel known as the Onoyau Pass, notorious throughout French Polynesia for its powerful, largely outgoing current. A passage considered genuinely dangerous enough that many captains simply choose to avoid it altogether, rather than risk navigating a channel that can push a vessel back out toward open ocean faster than its engine can push it in. Local accounts describe the pass as one of the most hazardous in the entire territory, narrow enough that timing and tide matter enormously, and unforgiving enough that even experienced sailors treat it with real caution. Combined with a lagoon too shallow in most places to accommodate large vessels, that single treacherous entrance has effectively kept cruise ships and larger tourist boats away from Maupiti almost entirely, a natural bottleneck limiting outside access in a way that no local ordinance could ever quite replicate. Whether by geological accident or fitting coincidence, the same dramatic volcanic landscape that makes Maupiti so beautiful has also made it genuinely difficult to overrun. Getting to the island by air isn't dramatically easier. Air Tahiti operates only a handful of weekly flights connecting Maupiti to the wider French Polynesian network, typically routed through Bora Bora or Tahiti itself, and for years, the island's small airstrip has remained deliberately unextended, even as tourist numbers elsewhere in French Polynesia have surged and larger aircraft have become the norm at busier island destinations. Local officials have openly stated that lengthening the runway to accommodate larger aircraft simply isn't on the table for now, a quiet but telling extension of the same philosophy that shaped the hotel ban in the first place. Growth is welcome, but only on terms the island itself controls, and only at a pace the existing community and its limited infrastructure can genuinely absorb without being overwhelmed by it. That said, Maupiti hasn't remained entirely closed off, and the past couple of years have brought a genuine, measurable shift in how easy the island is to reach. A fast passenger ferry service connecting Maupiti more directly to the wider Society Islands began operating a few years ago, cutting travel time considerably compared to the older, slower inter-island boats it replaced, and combined with the existing flight schedule, it has meaningfully increased the number of visitors able to reach the island without requiring an expensive charter or a lucky seat on a limited weekly flight. Local officials now estimate the island welcomes somewhere in the range of 40,000 visitors annually, a striking number for a resident population of only around 1,300 people, and one that would overwhelm many small island communities entirely, effectively meaning the island now receives roughly 30 visitors for every single permanent resident over the course of a year. Maupiti's mayor has publicly stated that the island has, so far, managed to absorb that growing visitor flow without abandoning its underlying model, insisting that any further growth continue to run through small, locally owned pensions, rather than large-scale hotel development, even as tourism numbers climb and pressure to expand accommodation options inevitably grows alongside them. Daily life on Maupiti still moves at a distinctly unhurried pace, shaped as much by practical necessity as by cultural preference. Beyond tourism, the island's economy rests on a modest combination of small-scale agriculture and fishing. Watermelon cultivation in particular has become one of the island's most recognized exports within French Polynesia, thriving in Maupiti's sandy volcanic soil in a way that has made the fruit something of a local point of pride. Alongside copra production from the island's coconut palms, a traditional Pacific export that has sustained island economies across the region for generations, the dried coconut flesh pressed into oil and shipped out through the same limited transport network that brings tourists in. The surrounding lagoon and open ocean beyond the reef remain rich fishing grounds, providing not just subsistence food for local families, but a genuine source of income, with tuna and other pelagic species caught by island fishermen sold both locally and, at times, exported to nearby islands with larger markets. One particular local delicacy, a type of small lobster-like crayfish known locally as varo, is hunted using a traditional technique passed down through generations, luring the creatures directly out of burrows in the sandy lagoon floor, using little more than patience, a steady hand, and knowledge of exactly how the animal responds to careful provocation. A skill considered something close to an art form among those who still practice it, and a dish rare and prized enough that finding it on a menu anywhere in French Polynesia is treated as a genuine expensive treat. Housing and community life reflect the island's small scale directly. Much of the population lives clustered around Maupiti's single main village, with the surrounding coastline and the scattering of small motu islets ringing the lagoon remaining largely undeveloped beyond the handful of family pensions built there, specifically to host visitors. A powerful cyclone that struck the island in the late 1990s destroyed a significant amount of the island's older, more traditional housing, flattening homes that had stood for generations, and forcing a wave of rebuilding that reshaped parts of the village, introducing more modern construction materials better suited to withstanding future storms. Though the island's fundamentally small, tightly knit community structure survived largely intact, families rebuilding side by side, much as they always had. Water remains one of the community's most persistent practical challenges even today, with most households still relying heavily on rainwater collected and stored in cisterns rather than a centralized municipal supply. A system local officials have continued working to expand and improve, pushing for funding to provide every household with a second storage tank, specifically to capture more of the rain that falls regularly across the island rather than losing it to runoff. Recognizing that reliable water storage matters just as much to daily life here as any tourism policy debated in distant government offices. Culturally, Maupiti carries the same deep roots found throughout the wider Society Islands, a Polynesian heritage stretching back centuries before any European contact. Still visible today in scattered ancient stone marae, ceremonial platforms once used for religious and communal gatherings, tucked quietly around the island's coastline and hillsides, remnants of a spiritual and social order that organized life here long before the first European ships ever appeared on the horizon. Some of these marae sites are believed to be among the oldest documented in the entire Society Islands chain, a detail that has drawn the occasional archaeologist or history enthusiast to an island most travelers still associate purely with its beaches, rather than its deeper past. Traditional dance, weaving, and craft work remain part of everyday cultural life, rather than performances staged purely for visitors. Practiced within families and passed down much the way they always have been, mothers teaching daughters to weave pandanus leaves into mats and baskets, elders sharing oral histories tied to specific stretches of coastline or particular motu, even as a modest, carefully managed stream of curious travelers now occasionally gets invited to observe or take part. Sundays in particular remain a genuine community anchor, church services drawing much of the island together in a rhythm that has changed little across generations. Limited flight availability and modest guest house capacity mean opportunities for outside income remain genuinely constrained compared to islands that fully embrace large-scale tourism, and younger residents seeking broader education or career opportunities often still need to leave for Tahiti or beyond, at least temporarily, a familiar pattern echoed across small island communities throughout the Pacific. Job options beyond fishing, farming, and the family pension business remain limited, and prices for imported goods, much like on any small, remote island, tend to run noticeably higher than on Tahiti or other more developed parts of French Polynesia, since virtually everything not grown or caught locally still has to travel in by boat or plane through the same narrow logistics network that carries tourists the other way. Infrastructure investment, from water storage to the length of the island's boat dock, continues to depend heavily on funding decisions made at the level of the wider French Polynesian government, a reminder that even an island determined to control its own development still operates within a broader political and financial system based well beyond its own shores, one where a small island commune of 1,300 people has to compete for attention and budget alongside the territory's much larger, more politically influential islands. But for the people who call Maupiti home, those trade-offs have, so far, remained worth it. Rather than watching international hotel chains reshape their coastline, dictate hiring decisions, and quietly draw the majority of tourism profit back off the island entirely, Maupiti's residents chose a slower, smaller, more directly controlled version of prosperity, one where a pension guest house run by a local family, a boat ride arranged personally by its owner, and a home-cooked dinner served at that same family's table remain the primary way most visitors ever experience the island at all. It's a model that will likely never generate anything close to the raw tourism revenue Bora Bora pulls in each year, but it's also a model that keeps almost everything the island does generate firmly within the community that generated it. In the end, Maupiti's story isn't really about resisting money at all. It's about a small community that looked closely at what large-scale tourism had done to a nearly identical island just across the water, weighed that outcome honestly against what they valued about their own quiet, close-knit way of life, and made a clear-eyed collective decision about which kind of future they actually wanted, even when the more lucrative option was sitting right there, repeatedly, for the taking. Paradise, it turns out, isn't only about how an island looks from the air. Sometimes it's about who still gets to decide what happens to it on the ground. If a community choosing simplicity over an obvious fortune surprised you, subscribe, because there are more places out there quietly proving that prosperity doesn't always have to look the way the rest of the world expects it to.